Welcome everyone to the Great Resignation, How to Reduce Turnover at Your Organization. I'm Taylor, part of the Culture Amp team. I want to welcome our moderator for today's session, Ken Matos, the Director of People Science at Culture Amp. Ken, I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you, Taylor. Hello, everyone. And as Taylor said, welcome to our presentation on the Great Resignation. We have a really amazing crew of panelists to speak to you today. I'm Ken Matos. I'm a director of people science at Culture Amp. My background is as an organizational psychologist, and I spent the last decade plus working in areas ranging from remote work and flexibility, diversity and inclusion, leadership, engagement, and mentoring. Also joining us today is Sarah Aviram. Sarah, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Ken. So excited to be here. I'm Sarah Aviram. Used to work in HR and talent development leadership roles, companies like PepsiCo, Avon, and IAC. Wrote a book called Remotivation, the remote worker's ultimate guide to life-changing fulfillment after I worked remotely from 12 different countries in 2019. And now I have my own business doing workshops and speaking engagements for companies on how to save them from the Great Resignation.
Wonderful, thank you. And we're also joined by Lars Schmidt. Lars?
Yeah, hey Ken, thanks for joining us all. I'm Lars Schmidt. I am the founder of Amplify, do a bit of HR executive search. I've created an accelerator to build capabilities and readiness for the next generation of chief people officers, and wrote a book and host a podcast called Redefining HR. So basically I'm a big nerd and advocate for modern HR and people practices, and try to get involved in projects that accelerate innovation in HR.
Wonderful, thank you. So as you can see, we have some really great talent on the call today. And just so you have an outline of how we're going to proceed, we just did our welcome. In a few moments, I'm going to go through an overview of some of the Great Resignation data that Culture Amp has collected from third-party sources and also from our own data. Then we'll have a discussion with the panelists, sort of exploring what this all really means in the day-to-day. And then we'll have a Q&A to about 15 to 20 minutes before the end of the session, so that we can hear from you and hopefully answer some of your more pressing questions. I'd also like to really encourage you to use the chat. There's going to be already 568 other professionals experiencing what you're going through, and the number continues to climb. So please feel free to throw down questions, thoughts, ideas. I think people in this community really like to learn from one another as well and hear about what's going on the ground. So Taylor will also be monitoring the chat and helping everybody have a great time. So with that, I'm going to dive into some data. So first, what is the Great Resignation? It's really helpful to just sort of have a sense of what are we talking about. So this is a term that was coined by Anthony Klotz in an NBC News article, where he was talking about the anticipated and now very much real and experienced a turnover wave that was going to come as a result of the experiences we've had over the past year, post the COVID pandemic, or at least when people felt safe enough to begin to transfer between jobs. And given the size of the registration for this webinar, it seems like that is a real experience that everybody is having. Data actually shows that it is definitely happening, at least in the US. So what we see on the screen here is data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. They have been tracking voluntary turnover since 2011. As you can see, it has been on a steady climb with a little bit ups and downs since 2011, with a huge drop at 2020. Not surprising, a lot of people did not want to experiment with new positions in the middle of a pandemic, not knowing what was going to happen to the economy. Right after that, we come to 2021, and the number of people who are quitting their jobs has exceeded the number that it's ever been any time since they started counting the numbers. So we are definitely experiencing a spike coming right off the back of a deep reduction in voluntary turnover. So even if it wasn't the highest number ever, it would still be a very significant shock to the system of organizations coming so quickly on such reduced turnover. So why do we think this is happening? So I can count at least 5 big reasons. 2 of them fall into this first bucket of work is really trying to stay the same. And so that takes two forms. One, employees are dissatisfied with their career options, and that's not new. That was really the case before COVID. A lot of the strong predictors of engagement on our survey was opportunity for career advancement. This is a really challenging issue for a lot of organizations because they believe that employees should be building their own career paths and trying to really understand where they want to go on their own unique journeys. However, employees often don't have the context they need or the perspective required to be able to carve out those kinds of career paths. And so that's one of the reasons why Culture Amp has been working on things like individual reports for employees so that they can see what's going on in the organization and some greater detail. This is a feature that's being released in September, so take a look out for it. But that's only because we knew that was happening well before the pandemic kicked on. And so there's also these other issues that have emerged somewhat since. So desire for flexibility isn't totally new, but people used to believe it when organizations said, it can only be this way where we're all in the office. And the reality is we've had a year and a half, approaching 2 years, of being somewhat successful, if not very successful, with remote work. And so that argument really just doesn't make sense to employees anymore. And so it's a lot harder for organizations to be able to say, you can't have flexibility while they've just done it successfully for 2 years. On the flip side, while organizations are trying to stay the same, employees are very different than they used to be. First, many of them are seeking a new path. The pandemic shattered lots of routines. It forced some deep introspection about the balance of work to life that people want to have. And it really forced them to make some changes that are now sort of steamrolling forward. And so even the New Yorker today just put out an article talking about how employees in knowledge jobs have started career downsizing. That is reorganizing their work life so that their careers are less of a big component of what they seek and that their personal lives are a much larger component. We're probably going to see more of that as time goes on. Second, a lack of humanity at work. 2020 required some really hard choices to be made for a lot of companies. And I don't want to ignore that fact, but some organizations didn't handle that in the most respectful fashion. And a lot of employees at those kinds of organizations feel somewhat betrayed by that management of things. And so they've been looking for changes now that changes are possible. And finally, there's the reality of some disappointing responses to social movements. COVID wasn't the only thing that happened in 2020. And a lot of people have really asked questions about the organizations they want to work with based on how those organizations responded. I think the pandemic really forced a reckoning with this concept of interpersonal responsibility that we had previously sort of pushed to the back of our minds. But once COVID brought it up and then experiences in 2020 around racial equity and other significant issues, I think has really changed the way people expect their organizations to function. Looking at our raw data, we see some interesting trends that suggest that there's actually multiple stories within the Great Resignation. So at least 2 of those stories seem to be based on whether or not you have higher turnover than recruiting or higher recruiting than turnover. So some of our industries have lots of recruiting going on, more so than they have turnover. For them, the Great Resignation is not going to be experienced as a sudden hollowing out of their workforce. They're going to experiencing it as a hollowing out of their expertise, as their most valuable employees get poached by competitors or completely third-party organizations who need to build out tech infrastructure, recruiting infrastructure. What are they going to do with remote work? A lot of my tech customers were still talking about high turnover and poaching, even while the COVID pandemic was in its fullest swing before the vaccination, because of how much needs suddenly emerged in their competitors. On the flip side, for those organizations like government, food and beverage, and sports clubs, we see an opposite trend. For them, is really more of a problem of short staffing. Their turnover has gone way up, their recruiting gone down because their revenues have gone down. And so they're falling into this dangerous spiral of short staffing, overwork, burnout leads to these explosive resignations that we hear about in the news and in media, which in turn leads to more short staffing, overwork, burnout, explosive resignations. And so pulling out of that downward spiral is going to be a very different experience than trying to stop your employees from getting poached. What do we do about it? Well, I think big picture, there's really one core solution to all of these different experiences. And that is trying to reimagine your employee experience so you can keep your best people and recruit more great talent. And so first, you need to ask yourself some very important questions, like, how are you making it easy to get work done despite the challenges of the pandemic? If you're asking people to make sacrifices and trust in you, how are you doing the same for them? And whatever you decide, are you doing it with a keen sense of respect for your employees as people, because they have other options right now in a way they might not have a year or two ago? And so there's a lot of different things you might need in terms of data to reimagine your employee value proposition, from continuous listening to predictive analytics, performance processes, really thinking about how you invest in managers, as well as growth and development. But in the end, it all really comes back to trying to tell your employees a convincing story of why they should weather this storm with you. So with all that preamble through, I will now stop presenting my screen and open the floor to Lars and Sarah to give us their take on what's going on. Lars?
Yeah, Sarah, why don't you take this one first and I'll jump in after you.
All right, sure, sounds good. So look, from my perspective, anytime we go through a pandemic or anyone goes through something so significant in their life as COVID, people feel loss and grieving and isolation. And so it's no surprise that they want to stay safe and stay in place and not make any changes. So seeing that huge drop is not so surprising, right? That people are just wanting to stay put, play it out. Let's see what happens. And now that, we're coming out of it, people are wanting more purpose. They're wanting more meaning. They're wanting to make more of an impact. They're reassessing, is this the work I enjoy doing? Because all those perks that made work fun were kind of taken away, right? The masseuses on, in the office and the ping pong tables in the break room and all that stuff was taken away. And what people were left with was the work itself during COVID. And so they were really assessing, like, is this work what I want to be doing? And that combined with everything else they were feeling. And I think the last point as well is that during this past year and a half or so, people were saving a lot of money. They weren't going on vacations. They weren't, making expenses that they usually had. And so what happens is they feel a little bit of this confidence with a financial safety net. And they're finally like, oh, well, maybe I should start that business now. I've always, wanted to start, or, I can pursue that passion, or I could take a break because I'm so burned out, and I could take a break from work altogether. And so I think that's also part of what's going on, is people are feeling more confidence to do things like that would have felt so risky before. And so I think that's a little bit of what's happening right now.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. What I would maybe add to that, I'll start with a question for all of you viewing. Are you the same person right now sitting in your seat watching this webinar as you were in February of 2020? Jump in the chat, share your thoughts on that with each other, because I'm willing to bet that most of you are not the same person as you were in February 2020. I'm not the same person I was in February 2020. And so we're seeing this shift at a size and scale that we have never experienced. The work constructs of how we did work, when we did work, where we did work, all of those things that had been in place for decades are now blown up. And there are some organizations that are trying to push back to that, reality that no longer exists, but they're not taking into account just the mass evolution of humanity and kind of our values and our drivers, and whether we have a bigger nest egg and we feel more confident in making different decisions, whether we've spent more time with our family over the last 18 months, and whether that was a good or a bad thing, right? Some of us were like, yes, I want to prioritize that. Others were like, man, get me back into an office. Everybody's experiencing this differently. And so I think that is a huge challenge and the huge opportunity for those of you that are in HR right now is how do we account for that? How do we adapt from systems that used to be fairly formulaic and playbook driven around how we supported employees, how we designed employee experience, to this new environment that has optionality and flexibility and allows employees to opt in to the constructs that best fit their lifestyles today, not their lifestyles pre-pandemic. And so that's the huge challenge and the huge opportunity, I think, for the field right now.
In some ways, I feel like this was coming long before COVID. COVID just sped up what we've been talking about with what's going to happen when the boomers retire, what's going to happen when millennials are running things. I think a big chunk of this is all those pain points just sort of broke all at once. And now that nothing is gelled anymore, it's much easier to have these hard conversations. People have these nest eggs. There's a way sort of to engage in debate and negotiation with your employer that you didn't have before. And most importantly, we're seeing that on a global scale because COVID hit everyone all at once in somewhat similar ways, whereas usually it happens one company, one region at a time, which mutes the effects.
Yeah, one thing I just want to add to that, because there's kind of an interesting dynamic of the unique space that we're in right now, particularly with so many of us still working, remotely. And again, I'm applying this comment to people who are in roles and organizations who have roles that have the ability to work remotely, and that's not all roles. So let's acknowledge that. But I'm just talking about the people that could be remote. The onboarding experience is even different. Like we talked about the Great Resignation, and oftentimes that argument and that conversation is framed around tenured employees leaving. The other side of that is also true. Like employees that come into our organization, if they come in and it's not a good onboarding experience, what we sold them doesn't match what they're actually experiencing in terms of the company, the culture, the teamwork, they are not going to be a sticky hire. They're going to be able to leave. And again, I do executive recruiting as well. I talk to a lot of candidates who are still in that onboarding phase who are like, yeah, they kind of pitched me something that isn't my reality here. And if I'm going to make a move, it's better to just kind of cut my losses and move on now. And so it puts added pressure, yes, to retain our tenured employees, but also to be really smart and proactive in our onboarding and integration efforts. Because if we're not, those people we're working so hard to bring into the organization are going to be very loose hires, and it's going to be easy to pull them out into another role, especially as competitive as hiring is right now.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I want to make sure that, I know there's a lot of HR people on this call, and you too are employees yourselves of organizations and feeling a lot of this too. So I know you have a double role in here, which is challenging, but I want to make sure that both from the company side and employee side, that we're not being short-sighted. Employees are saying, if you don't allow me to work remotely or flexibly, I'm going to find a company that will. And, from my experience and my research and working from all these different countries and talking to remote workers who had the extremes of being able to work from the beach in Bali, and they thought that would make them feel so fulfilled and so motivated. And it was a short-term solution for sure. But in the long run, after a few months, a lot of them were like, yeah, I feel stuck. Something is still missing. And it was because they didn't like the work itself. So it didn't matter that they took their work from Baltimore to Bali. The work itself wasn't exciting and energizing and motivating to them. And so, yes, a company can say, oh, we're being competitive, we're allowing our employees to work remotely, but that's not the solve all for everything. And so, yes, giving employees a choice of where they work is certainly empowering. But what's even more empowering is the fulfillment that comes from doing work that you actually want to be doing. And that's what's going to retain your employees, build loyalty and trust. And, employees are just feeling really burnt out, and they feel like they want this fresh start. They want this new beginning. And so the question is, are you going to help them figure out how to have a new beginning within your company? Or are you going to let them figure it out how to do it somewhere else? And the truth is, if you don't have these conversations with them, they're going to assume that they can't do it in your company. And that might not be the case. And then they'll just go somewhere else. So getting back to fundamentals of really good career development discussions, not just stay interviews, really improving practices that may have already been in place and asking questions that go way deeper than we may have had to have gone before are going to be really important moving forwards.
I'm also noticing a fun theme in the chat around Gen X and sort of where do they fit in all of this. I think one really concrete Gen X experience right now is parenting and elder care. And so when we talk about the remote work phenomenon that's happening, it's not just young people with no ties wanting to travel around the world and see cool things. It's also people just trying to find a way to care for their loved ones in a demanding economy, especially while things like childcare are still shuttered. And so I think there's multiple reasons and experiences for many of these policies, but the policies themselves can be very inclusive and hit all these different things simultaneously. But it's important to not get fixated on one reason, because that usually makes it easier for somebody to sort of shoot it down as, they're just being childish or lazy or wanting some grand adventure, when a huge chunk of your employees are like, I also just want to survive.
I think that's right. I think one thing we also have to be careful of is, I've never really bought into a lot of the generational stereotypes in terms of employee drivers and what people, need and want. I've seen, it's just, to me, it's kind of lazy thinking to be able to just kind of paint a whole generation with the brush of saying, well, they want this, they want flexibility, they want, I remember we probably all read the countless articles on, like the Gen Y, they want, corporate social responsibility. So you have to have that in your EVP if you're going to recruit Gen Y. Like, no, you don't. No, and so I just think it's interesting. Like the layers of what we're experiencing right now are not necessarily generational layers; they're individual layers. And so I think it's important that we take a step back and we not kind of target any of our strategies towards a specific generational demographic and more towards flexibility of allowing people to opt in where they are in their own life circumstances and what their own personal drivers are, regardless of age, regardless of, generational, stereotype. I think something to pin on there. By the way, proud Gen X here. But I am saying, I think that's something that we do need to be cautious of generalizing based on generations.
I agree. I think individualizing the career development and retention process is critical. I think getting back to some really core fundamentals, I don't know if it has to be anything revolutionary people or HR professionals need to do right now. I think as far as something new and never been done before, I think it's getting back to these fundamentals of setting really clear goals for people so that regardless of where they're working, it's really clear for them and for their managers whether or not they're performing. Before it was, I know you're performing because you're sitting at your desk. And let's be honest, people are on Facebook for many hours of the day. So what did that tell anyone? And I think what happened during COVID is that we were all in this equal playing field, right? Everyone was remote and the only way performance could be measured was by the quality of the deliverables. And now going back to these hybrid models or back to work, there's a concern about the sort of class A, class B type of thing that might happen, whereas the people back in the office are going to be the ones given more opportunities and more attention and preference, and then the people that choose to work from home are going to be forgotten about. And so I think it's really important that there's consistency and equity in the way that, goals are set, performance management, and getting back to good fundamentals like good process documentation and knowledge management, things that you probably realized were so important when everyone was working remotely. You couldn't stop by the one guy's desk who knows everything and ask him a question. So getting back to a lot of these fundamentals so that people know how they're being evaluated, what performance is based on, and having good conversations with them, like managers asking their employees, what's going on in your head? What are you thinking you want to do next? Or what obstacles are getting in the way of you performing at your best? And building that trust so that an employee will then come to you when they're thinking about leaving and say, I feel comfortable, and have that sort of psychological safety too, to say, hey, I want to be honest with you. Here's what I'm thinking of. And I don't know if I can have those opportunities at this company. And then the manager has an opportunity to address it and to see if that's possible or not. And so I think showing employees that you care about their entire career and not just caring about them for the time that they're working in your company is going to be really critical, because they're going to leave on the great note if they leave, or they might stay, which is fantastic. And if they leave, they're going to be a champion of your company. They're going to talk to other people about it. And they may be even one of those boomerang employees that decides to come back in the future once they gain a little bit of a different experience.
So I'd like to throw out a challenger question. So, and I'd love to hear from people in the audience in the chat as well. The thing that I'm imagining is going to be the challenge is, how do you scale this individualized support? So yeah, we can say, well, the managers will do it. Will they? I mean, that has been the HR like catchphrase / bane for as long as I've been in the field. How do we get this sort of individualized career support and development into the hands of individual people, or create some sort of scalable model that allows us to do it for our organization and not just the people who are closest to this, the cool HR team who are listening on this call?
I mean, I can jump on that first. I think the way that you need to be thinking about flexibility isn't one-to-one, right? Especially if you're working in an enterprise company, you're like, absolutely, that will never work. And you're right. But the idea is having different packages, perhaps, that people can opt into. And that's where you provide the flexibility. I was talking to Thomas Ageme, who runs people operations at ServiceNow, and they have over 10,000 employees. And we're talking about flexibility on the podcast. And he said, look, the way that we think about it isn't one-to-one, but creating a range of different options that employees can opt into based on their own lifestyle, values, personal circumstances, so that it's not one size fits all. And that, to me, is the big shift. Like when you think about personalization, it's a scary term, because naturally in HR, we're like, well, this is one-to-one, and how can I possibly manage that across X thousand employees? The answer is you can't. But if you can create different structures and packages that people can opt into, that is still flexible, that's still choice, but it allows you to offer that at scale. And so I would challenge all of you that are thinking about personalization flexibility. Don't think about it on a one-to-one basis, because you'll pull your hair out. You're like, haven't I been through enough the last 18 months? And the answer is yes, you have. So don't think about it that way. Think about, doing different grouping of packages. Maybe for some people who are, they're at a stage of their career where they want more flexibility. Maybe they don't want to work 40 hours a week. Maybe they want to experience role share. Right? They want to, split their duties. Maybe they want to be able to have some experience working in a different area, maybe career reinvention at some point, right? Creating different programs like that people can opt into that allow you to offer flexibility, but also allow you to scale that flexibility with your size. I think that's an important way to frame it.
Yeah, I love those examples. And what I would add to that is, I think a lot of challenges that all companies face is that they promote individual contributors that are rock stars, and they put them into management roles, and that person really struggles. And part of it is because they haven't been trained, right, on how to delegate and coach and team build and all the things that are required to be a good manager. And part of it is also, they thought the only way to get promoted and grow their career or make more money was to move into management. And so offering them different opportunities, and like Lars is saying, doesn't necessarily have to be individual, but there could be for a certain department, individual contributor growth path where they can continue to move up and exceed and take on larger scope of role without needing to manage other people. So they might be a great subject matter expert that doesn't make a good manager, and they need to feel like they still have options within your company. So just another example and way to think about it.
That's great. I think there's another thing we should do and pivot a little bit from the remote work conversation to what happens if remote work isn't really an option for your organization. How do you respond to the Great Resignation? And so I would say, from one perspective, really thinking about if you're falling into that short staffing overwork spiral that I was describing earlier, and really trying to double down on mission, because what you're really asking people to do is help hold the organization together until it can be reformed or reborn in a new market. And that requires people being connected to something larger than just their paycheck. And so I think a doubling down on mission will really help there, if you can have a mission that people can be motivated by for your business. For others, I think it is going to be some really honest conversations about what is necessary in order to keep the business going, and what can you give people to make that experience more viable? Whether that be more say, more conversation, different benefits, something that says, weather the storm with us and you will come out better on the other end than if you went somewhere else. Because in the end, employees are thinking about themselves, their families, their careers, their lives, not just how do I keep this business afloat? And keeping that in mind can really help open the door to other possibilities. Lars, Sarah, any thoughts there for organizations that aren't remote flexible?
I think you hit on it, that it doesn't, there's a lot of people that do want to come back to the office, that do enjoy that kind of environment and camaraderie. I mean, yes, a lot of people want to continue to have that flexibility, but a lot of people are yearning to go back. And I think the key here is going to be, some type of flexibility and, allowing people to be part of deciding what the process is going to look like. The power is shifting more to the side of the employee these days. And I think we need to take some learnings perhaps from, product development people who focus on, user experience and design thinking, and kind of think of the customer and that being the employee in this case, from HR standpoint, and how do we involve them in the process, and how do we iterate with them on what our company is going to look like, and the processes and policies we should have, they're going to fit our culture. And so I think the more people can be involved in the process, the better result it's going to have on both ends.
Yeah, I think that those are all great points from Sarah. The one thing I would maybe add, Ken, as you talk about employees who aren't able to work remotely, so maybe non-exempt work, people who are frontline employees, I think we have to value them in ways that we haven't necessarily valued them before, right? I think that there is a general understanding and kind of okayness, that's not a word, I'm making it up, that staff was just going to have high attrition. That it was just going to be lots of turnover. We had to build that into our talent plans, and that level of turnover was acceptable. It was more acceptable to experience that than perhaps to invest in them from pay raises, from benefits, from career developmental opportunities. And now we're seeing that maybe that is no longer sustainable, right? You're seeing Domino's offering $500 signing bonuses for people to deliver pizza. We're seeing things that in this economy we've never seen before. And so I think it will be causing us to value all employees on a more even field than perhaps we had in the past.
I think this also reminds me of something I saw almost 10 years ago in manufacturing, where manufacturing companies had built up this pool through learning and development and training programs of skilled professionals who could use some really advanced equipment in their organizations. And then they cut all those learning and development programs because they said they had enough of those people. Then all their competitors poached everyone away from them, and they had no way to build out a new pipeline. And so there was this huge anxiety about what happens when they all retire because that group had gotten older. We haven't built up anybody behind them. This was a skilled labor job that needed to be on site. And this kind of poaching environment just sort of emerged. So I think some of the things have happened before, but always on very localized industry or regional zones. What's really blowing everyone's minds is how much it's happening to everyone kind of simultaneously. Yeah. I'd actually just saw something in the chat, a question about, what about employee loyalty? Does that exist today? I have a very strong feeling about that, but I'd love to give Lars and Sarah a chance to offer their perspective first.
Ken, you left us hanging. You opened with a strong feeling that you're going to hold on us until the end. Now we're all waiting. I mean, look, I think loyalty is a two-way street. Yes, loyalty does exist, but it has to be reciprocated. And companies have demonstrated also they have not been loyal to employees, and so to expect loyalty when you're not demonstrating it is probably a recipe for disappointment. This is an environment where I think employees, again, part of this whole resetting that we've all experienced, I think employees, loyalty absolutely does still exist, but it probably takes a secondary driver to loyalty towards one's family and personal circumstances and situation. And so if you're not creating an environment that nurtures that supports that gives them what they need to support that, it's going to be hard for them to be loyal to you. So yeah, that's my initial take. But Sarah, what's your perspective?
No, I think you hit it right on, Lars. Perfect. And I'd love to hear what Ken thinks about it, since he has got such a strong opinion.
Well, I actually find the word loyalty to be a red flag for me. If a company starts talking about we're all very loyal here, that translates to me 9 out of 10 times to mean I'm going to ask you to do more than I've actually engaged in the contract with. I'm going to put pressure on you to make sacrifices in other spaces, because that's the only way you can show loyalty. It's a concept from like the red badge of courage. You only really know somebody's willing and devoted to you when they give up something that they love in exchange. And so that loyalty phrasing is almost always a really, hey, this sounds like great, but I think I'm going to go someplace else. And I think you're hitting it really hard on the head, Lars, when you're saying, hey, what have you done in return? The market has not been friendly to people who've shown loyalty. Companies have been told they have to be willing to make sacrifices in order to hit their numbers. And so people are usually the sacrifices that get made. And I think what we're seeing is employees have decided to run their careers with the same amount of transactionality that their employers have offered them, or at least that the iconic employer has. Any one employer can be really wonderful and loyal and defensive, but the market doesn't necessarily make that a safe choice. And at any moment, you might find out that that isn't who your employer really is.
Yeah, I'm seeing people in the comments say it's like when managers or leadership call everyone a family at the company, and how that triggers people to be like, no, we're not a family. No, stop calling us that.
You can't fire me from the family, but you can fire me from this job. So we have a few minutes left before we should go into the proper Q&A section. So Lars, Sarah, is there anything you want to make sure that we hit that we haven't yet?
I mean, the one thing I would just add is, obviously we're all here to talk about the Great Resignation, and we're all here to talk about retention. And I'll maybe offer one counterintuitive point to this, is that we shouldn't retain everybody. I think that HR, our background has been deeply oriented around like retention at all costs, right? And really wired around like, how do we keep everybody? You shouldn't keep everybody. And we have to understand, like, our employees have been through so much. We've been through so much. Everybody's been through so much over the last 18 months. Some people are just done. They need a fresh start. And to Sarah's point, maybe they can find that inside your organization, and you should explore that with them. You shouldn't just give up on them if they say that they're no longer happy in their role. But, there may not be the right next step for them. And we have to do better in HR at helping people transition on gracefully from our organizations. It creates goodwill. It's good for employer brand. It's good to Sarah's point earlier on boomerang hires. It creates those opportunities. But for some people, it's just time for them to go, and that's okay. And we have to be comfortable with that. So just again, counterpoint to the idea of retention. Sometimes we have to be okay letting our people go.
Yeah, and I think the last point is the role of the manager has really changed from perhaps, in some organizations, a command and control type model to, oh, I don't even know where my employees are. I don't know if they're in the office. I don't know if they're getting things done. And so I think really doubling down on your managers that have what we used to call the soft skills that are no longer soft, like empathy and emotional intelligence, and people that can really ask the right questions. And so there should be no surprises when an employee says, I'm burned out, I want to go. Because if you're checking in with them regularly, hopefully you're getting ahead of some of those things. And yeah, and to Lars's point, like the right decision for the employee might be that they should exit. And that might not be the best thing for the company, but I think, again, people need to think sometimes a bit more long-term about what the best decisions are to make in both situations.
Absolutely. Thank you. Taylor, I know you've been monitoring the chat and the Q&A. Are there any questions that you'd like to bring to the fore?
Yeah, definitely. I think we've been seeing a lot of questions around compensation, salary bonuses. Is that a strong enough reason to stay in the end, or where does that fall into it?
I think that's a powerful question. one thing I would say is COVID has made a lot of these conversations existential. And by that, I mean, they've become life or death in a way they weren't before. So while some industries have life or death conversations on the regular, for example, mining or firefighting have those kinds of dynamics in the conversation and the packaging, most office jobs did not. And so I think that's an angle that needs to be thought about when you're saying, like, can I just give you more money? Like, well, yes, but there comes a point where I may just not be able to buy into the more money to go into something that I feel might be risky to the lives of myself or my family.
Yeah, I mean, working in HR in many companies and having witnessed a lot of counter offers that have happened from a monetary perspective, it's almost always a short-term solution. The person stays, or maybe their title gets elevated and they're like, great, now that I'm a VP, I can go find a VP role somewhere else. Because it was most of the time, and I shouldn't say most of the time, a lot of the time, it's not about the money, the reason they want to leave. And so we counteroffer with more money, but we don't really offer anything else of what they truly want because we're not asking the right questions. And so it doesn't help so much. And look, I get it. Sometimes companies do need a short-term solution. There's a huge project or initiative going on, and we need to keep that person, but at least you're consciously knowing, okay, this is a short-term decision we're making in order to get the support we need to finish something. But I just want people to realize that it's not necessarily long-term.
Yeah, one thing just to add that real quick, and for any of you that are watching that do recruiting right now, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but like there's an insane arms race currently happening for talent, and compensation is insanely inflated, right? There's a bubble around compensation right now, and people are moving to take advantage of that, understandably so. But that's not gonna last. At some point, that's going to burst. And then you're going to have this issue where, you've said, well, to hire these people, we need to pay, 20%, 40% over market. Now you have these people in your organization that are 40% over market, and you have these people that are at market, and you have these people at under market. And so what does that do from an internal equity standpoint? What does that do from a culture standpoint? What does that do from a pay equity standpoint, right? There's lots of real risks that you undertake when you kind of decide to enter that arms race. I would recommend, you've got to pay competitive, you've got to pay competitive across the board. But if you're chasing that, quote unquote, top talent by throwing all the money at them, you're going to create anomalies within your organization that are going to come back to bite you.
I would also add that if you do make a counter offer or capture someone, you should change their job description to include documenting the key knowledge and historical information that they have, so that if they do turn around and say, that was a nice bump in salary or title, now I'm going to go somewhere else, a lot of their knowledge has been written down so that other people can step into that gap. Really emphasizing this idea of, great, how can we make it so that you're less absolutely essential as part of this deal will probably balance out some of those scales. Taylor.
Yes.
Any other questions?
We have a bunch. Another one that came up is, what if your company is doing a lot of the things we're talking about in terms of taking care of their people? However, no matter how well we're doing our job and to keep people, attracting talent is extremely difficult. Does anyone have any advice or data on how we should consider approaching people and how to attract them?
So one thing that I saw in conversations with manufacturing companies a number of years ago was that they were trying to attract new people to the industry after years of messaging that those were not great jobs. True or untrue, that was the messaging that the next generation had heard, and so they weren't aspiring to those opportunities. And so one of the things they need to really lean into is remarketing the industry and what it offered in a way that spoke to what that next generation that they were trying to recruit would be invested in. And so thinking about, we can give you that learning and development ladder because we have a much more structured organization than many of these service economy jobs do, was a thing that they could put forward that people would value. And so I think one thing is really checking to see if the general value proposition for your industry and work is valued. If not, trying to at least make a local change in that. And then B, how can you get your employees to help you identify the messaging that made them want to join so that you can tailor your job ads to the things that make people excited about your work without removing what might be some harsh realities on the side. We don't want to trick people, but we want them to be able to see what's great about what you're offering.
Yeah, I would just add in there like a quick hack, take your, and I don't know the size of your organization, whoever asked that question, but take your last 20, 50, 100 hires, survey them all, create a survey, use, whatever tool you want to use, and ask them why they join, why do they stay, what surprised them about the organization once they did join, good and bad, right? Take that data, use that to help you craft your job descriptions, your external job postings, I should say. Use that to craft your employer brand narrative. Tell an authentic and real view of what it's like to work there. And don't be afraid to share the warts as well, because the idea of employer branding and recruiting effectively, especially in a hyper competitive market, is you want to give prospects as much data as you can so that they can make informed decisions about how that role and organization does or does not align with their own drivers. And sometimes that means sharing warts as well, so that again, people can make more informed decisions. So I would, that data from those recent hires will be gold for you in crafting the kind of message that's gonna work in this particular market.
Yeah, I love that. I would just add that I think employers will be surprised sometimes too about what comes up that they hadn't really considered as part of their employer brand or marketing strategy for new candidates, including, the kind of impact people feel like they're making and how that, or the values of the organization, things like that might come up that might be great selling points.
I would add one other thing, which is also consider doing candidate surveys. And what you'd be looking for there is amongst the people that don't take the job, do they not take the job for a reason you agree with, where they're like, I wanted to do X and you just don't do X at this company. Great, that's a good reason for you not to join us. You would have churned anyway. Or are they saying, I want to do Y, you're like, but we do Y here. What went wrong in our messaging in this recruitment process that sent you spinning away? I think that can also really help you pin down, do you need to change something about your organization, or do you just need to change something about your marketing?
Okay, we have a bunch more, but I'll try and pull a few more before we have to wrap up today, guys. We're seeing a lot of questions around Black, Indigenous people of color, and are we seeing a higher resignation rate with them, and what they can do if they're seeing raises being and promotions given to others and not the non-marginalized groups?
That is a sticky one. So I think the second half of that, I think first you want to do pay equity analyses, you want to do promotion equity analyses. Is there people who are receiving the same ratings, the same recognition of quality, but not getting the rewards? And that, I think, is one concrete thing to first establish what is the reality of your business and the decisions that you're making, and then being able to reflect back, okay, if it is appropriate, what are the signals that we need to make clearer to people across all groups of how you get these promotions? Is that clear, or has it become hidden behind you managed to get the right mentor curtain? I think that's the other big piece that organizations, for better or for worse, often are very fuzzy about what they expect from people, and then make decisions on the back end based on what you sort of randomly threw at them. I think being a lot more concrete and putting some skin in the game of saying, this is what we think are the competencies and skills needed to at least be at the next level, even if it's not very job specific, will give a much more even playing field and a much clearer set of context for all of your employees, but especially your underrepresented employees, to be able to get into the promotion and raise game.
Perfect. We have another one. From a reporting perspective, what trends have you found most helpful to track and retain talent and understand your turnover issues?
Could you repeat the question?
Yep. From a reporting perspective, what trends have you found most helpful to track to retain talent and understand your turnover issues?
So some of what we've seen in our surveys would be learning and development, as we said at the beginning, where a lot of employees have been in a sense of waiting for 2 years and are now going, do I need to wait another 2 years to get to where I want to go? Or is there a really clear process to go through that will sort of fast track me to catch up on these years that I've been waiting for advancement and just sort of treading water? So I think that's one trend that we've been seeing floating around. I think in addition, there's been a lot of conversation about transparency and whys for things. I think a lot of organizations are trying very hard to go backwards, and they're just saying, well, the old way was the best way, without really explaining why was the old way the best way, and why are we trying to reinstate it in this seemingly very different world. We've seen a lot of conversation and comments about why are you doing these things, because they don't seem to match my lived reality.
Yeah, what is a quick point to add on the, old way is the best way. Change is hard, and experiencing new things is uncomfortable. And I think a lot of the leaders who are trying to push back to legacy constructs of work, that's because that's all they know. That's where they were comfortable. They themselves didn't like working from home. So how can my employees work from home? I don't like working from home, and I'm the CEO, right? Like, I think those are some of the conversations that are happening right now, but we have to really push and kind of assert ourselves as HR leaders in those environments. Bring data, bring case studies, bring competitive analysis. What are your competitors doing? How are they, gaining an advantage over you on the talent market because they're having more flexible constructs? I think having that data becomes really important, but it's easy, and you will face leaders who want to go back to that comfortable space because change is hard, and we have to really work hard to steer them towards this new direction, because a lot of them aren't going to go there willingly, and some of them, to be honest, are going to have to experience pain before they're willing to do that. They're going to have to force people to go back into the office or go back into work constructs they're not willing to do, and they have to leave, and then they have to realize, ooh, okay, wait, there is pain associated with that decision. Maybe that's not the right decision right now. So again, it's all part of this process. We're going to be in this period of flux and instability. This isn't ending this year. This is going to be carrying into 2022. So we just have to be prepared for that instability and volatility, as we continue moving through the pandemic and everything else that's happening right now.
I really want to double down what Lars was saying. I think we should also recognize the humanity of our leaders in this moment, that they're not necessarily doing the reversion just because they want to be simple or rigid. For a lot of them, it's all they've known. It's all they know that works. They're stressed out and scared too. And it is human nature to revert to established patterns when you are stressed or anxious. And so I think there's a real need to acknowledge that. I have a blog on my LinkedIn that talks about the different reasons why leaders resist change and some of what you can do to take action on that. And I think that's a helpful perspective on things like they're feeling that they've lost confidence, or they're feeling that they've lost a sense of history with what they've been doing and the continuity of it. So I think that piece is also really important for people to keep in mind.
And Sarah, I'd love to get your perspective, just with the research you've done on remote specifically. What have you seen to be effective, perhaps, in compelling leaders to be more open to remote constructs, who maybe do have more of that traditionalist lean or default?
Yeah, I think it's giving people a chance and seeing what's working and not working, and having really open communication about it. When I did this 12 countries in 12 months thing, it was a really honest conversation with my CEO where I said, look, I want to try this, and let's be really clear about what my goals and deliverables are going to be, so that we know that I'm performing regardless of where I'm working, and that we're going to be honest about, what's not happening, like what's not working for me, what are the challenges getting in my way, what are the obstacles. And by making it really just an open conversation, and him letting me know it's okay if I failed, and kind of giving that trust was huge for me, because I didn't feel like a tons of pressure to prove myself, although of course that was there to some extent, but it was like, and it's okay if it doesn't work, it'll be a learning, and then we can figure out how do we do it better for more people, or when we bring it out. So again, it comes back to just creating a lot of trust between managers and employees, because when employees feel like they're not going to be attacked by sharing an obstacle or a challenge, managers will get so many more insights into how they can really upgrade policies, processes, talent, and like their company as a whole.
One mechanism I found to operationalize what you're describing, Sarah, is to provide your margin for experimentation. So the easiest way to describe it is sort of in a sales term. So if you have a salesperson who wants to try a different approach, you will allow their revenue quota to go down by a certain amount as part of the experiment without penalty. If it goes below that point, you revert back to the norm and they have to work from that perspective. But that gives people cushion and confidence that if they experiment and either win outrageously or maybe lose just a little bit, they're still going to be fine, as opposed to I either win outrageously or I just get punished, which means why would I ever try anything that could advance your business to the next stage? Taylor, I think we have time for one more question.
Yep. We have someone asking, what advice would you give to communicating with the employees who are staying and witnessing the Great Resignation on the inside, and the kind of calm that panic that they might be feeling?
I would say really call out the reality of the situation, that people are pursuing their own life's journeys. And that doesn't mean that your life's journey has to look like theirs. You don't necessarily have to leave, but you don't necessarily have to stay. I think if you can really engage people in, what do you love about this job now? What could you love about it tomorrow that would make you want to stay? I think you can really get people to say, I'm so happy that my colleague has found their next chapter, their next calling, but my next chapter is still here. In a very real way, I would almost want every employee to say, tomorrow I'm turning the page to the next chapter of my life. That chapter might have the same setting, but it's still a new chapter. So I have that sense of renewal that I think everybody's kind of hungry for, but it doesn't necessarily have to translate into getting a new job. It might just be doing different work, or it might be recommitting to the work that you've always done with a different perspective on its value.
I would also add that, as challenging as it might be to see a lot of employees you're close with leave an organization, and especially when they're doing it voluntary, it makes you think, wait, should I be leaving? Is there something, but with change comes a lot of opportunity for the people that stay. And I think helping your employees understand, look, everyone has their individual reasons for leaving. Let's figure out what opportunities or benefits could come out of this for you. What new roles might you want to take on? What projects or initiatives could you lead? What skills do you want to develop? And making them feel like, oh, well, this is an opportunity for me. I'm not one of the people who stayed because I didn't have a better option. No, my best option is here right now at a company that knows me, that's willing to take a risk on me, where I have built credibility and relationships. So I think positioning it that way will be really helpful for employees.
Well, I hate to even go after Sarah, because those were such awesome points on framing. The only thing that I would add to that would be, don't put your head in the sand about what is actually happening, right? I think so many companies don't message anything. And of course your employees are talking and they're like, oh, we just lost another one. Or we just lost another one. Is this company sinking? In the absence of information, people are going to formulate their own opinions, and it's not going to be good for you. So get ahead of the communication. Another thing you may want to think about is hopefully you are doing exit interviews with everybody that's leaving, and you're identifying trends in those exit interviews that you can then proactively communicate to your employees who are still there, what you're doing to address some of those. So again, it's a way to just say, hey, look, we know that X, Y, and Z might be issues that might make other places more attractive. Here's what we're doing about X, Y, and Z, and we value you and we want you to be a part of this next journey. But I think being able to share that openly will help just offset the lack of information that might cause people to assume the worst.
Wonderful. And that brings us to exactly time. So I just want to say thank you to Sarah and Lars for joining us on this session. It is recorded and will be sent out to registrants. And thank you to everyone who participated in the chat or merely by listening in and having their own thoughts. Have a great day, everyone, and good luck with managing the Great Resignation and what comes after.